Sabina. I'd like to thank both Hildegund and Sabina for the invitation to speak at the International Summer Academy of Arts. I would also like to thank Hans Belting, Monika Juneja, and Peter Friedl for putting into place the contours of a very lively and stimulating debate yesterday. I would like to take this discussion forward by underlining certain interesting subtexts that informed the discussion yesterday. Firstly, there was the question of the we who are afflicted by the problem of defining global art. Is this a Eurocentric we, or an institutional we speaking from the academy and museum, or is it a we who sees the discipline of art history breaking down and being made irrelevant by its supposed objects of inquiry? And I'm going to take this up later, although it sounds a little apocalyptic. Secondly, I was struck by the tendency to map paradigmatic shifts onto discursive and exhibitional ruptures. Clearly, we have been attending to the inner adjustments of art history through changes within the academy, writing, and pedagogy. Belting gave us an excellent account of the genealogy of the term global art. But what was left undiscussed yesterday is the way in which paradigm shifts have been attempted outside the West, outside the classical institution of art history, in the domain of a politics that mediates between culture and the post-colonial national space. My paper, to begin with, will speak of such alternative starting points of a global consciousness, a globalism before globalism. The paper is titled Global Art, Institutional Anxiety and the Politics of Naming. I shall begin, as it were, in media res, with the critic John Berger's message to the first edition of Triennale India, which was organized by the Indian critic and novelist Mulk Raj Anand and opened in New Delhi in the fateful year of global upheaval and transition, 1968. Berger wrote, and I quote, "I send my greetings to the first Triennale of Contemporary World Art to be held in India. It would suggest the possibility of escaping from or even overthrowing the hegemony of Europe and North America in these matters. This hegemony is disastrous because whatever the personal feelings or ideas of individual artists or teachers may be, it is based upon the concept of visual work as a property. The historical usefulness of such a concert has been long past. It stands now as a barrier to further development. The ideology of modern European property is inseparable from imperialism. The fight against imperialism and all its agencies is thus closely connected with the struggle for a truly modern art. I wish you clear-sightedness, strength, and courage in your struggle." End of quote. John Berger, London, January 10, 1968. And so I begin this section of my paper with the alternative beginnings of a global consciousness. Berger's message of 1968, despite the ringing tones of a 1960s left rhetoric, reminds us that internationalism is not necessarily the monopoly of the industrially advanced societies and the imperialist polities of West Europe and North America. The societies of the global South can equally stake their claim to articulate a vision of the world and stake a claim to belong in a world of their own envisioning. The will to globality, as Okwi Envisor has observed, is not reserved only for those who can shuttle across the globe at will. It can and is also exercised by those whose mobility is either constrained or involuntary, those trapped in oppressive systems or those forced to migrate by adversity. And to such figures, the will to globality is a form of resistance, a form of self-articulation against all odds. In the early phase of independence, the post-colonial societies of the global South had to confront a specific global structure of necessity, of economic and political asymmetry, because the process of colonization had already conscripted them into the world system of capital. At the same time, they could also draw on two sources of freedom, which promised new forms of globalist consciousness. Firstly, members of the formerly colonized societies could subscribe to the same spectrum of leftist internationalist thought and activity that was shaking the societies of Europe. Therefore, it's not surprising that Berger, who wrote the message to Triennale India 1968, and Mulkraj Anand, who organized this Triennale, were united within the spectrum. Anand had been socialized within Fabian socialist and anarchist circles in London and had fought on the anarchist side in the Spanish Civil War. And second, these societies could also retrieve anterior histories of a planet-wide coalitions and connections in which they had participated in the pre-capitalist and pre-imperialist epoch. Am I going too fast? So I should go a little slow. Forgive me. Globalism is not the outcome of a particular Western logic of economic and political expansion. Rather, it inheres in the transnational networks of the pre-capitalist epoch. The Mughal, Qing, Safavid, and Ottoman empires each had their own world-circling networks of trade, pilgrimage, and diplomacy. The Islamic world conceived of the planet as the space for the amplification of the Ummah, held together by the protocols of pilgrimage. The Buddhist world saw itself as a web spreading from a point of origin in northern India outward to diverse terrains. The Silk Route, the Spice Route, and the exchange networks of the Indian Ocean and the Mediterranean all offered proposals for the envisioning and the realization of worldwide social structures. What you have here is the Award of Honor which was offered by the Triennale India. Thus, the ideological position of the 1968 Triennale India was clear. It was intended to demonstrate that a globalist consciousness and internationalism does not flow only from the former imperial centers to the former colonies. That is why I believe it is important to reinsert this neglected and even lost history into our discussion of present-day globalism. The narrative of globalization, with its driving momentum and many discontents, is all too often told from the vantage point of a West whose energies were triumphantly redeemed from the wastage of the Cold War and unleashed onto the planet at large from the early 1990s onwards. That narrative demands to be interrogated, dismantled, and opened out to accommodate other voices and other trajectories. My own concern in this debate is to emphasize the robust tradition of an internationalism articulated in and from the global South. A globalism from the South that was and is based on the shared perception across borders and disciplines of being caught up in the same historical predicament, confronting similar crises, looking for instruments and resolutions. And before I go on further to explain the politics of the Triennale India, I just decided to insert an image of the world map made by Al-Idrisi. And this is from Kitab al-Ruja. Al-Idrisi made this map for Roger of Sicily, and they were Arabized Normans. And I have inserted this map here because it, in a way, symbolizes globalism before globalism. Because I was talking about the global south, I decided that I would also bring in, for the first time, a world map which was envisioned by Al-Idrisi. And for, again, Roger of Sicily, and that is why the book is called Kitab al-Ruja. So it's Roger's book. So it is also a kind of subtext to my paper where I'm talking from the global south, and it's also a map where they show the south above and the north below, because it depends on the orientation of the very specific cosmology. But to go back to the politics of the Triennale India, the Triennale India was one of the cultural manifestations of the third position in the global politics of the Cold War period. In the 1950s, 5 visionary leaders of the post-World War II world. So you have Nehru, you have Kwame Nkrumah, you have Nasser, you have Tito, and you have Sukarno, and you have Tito. So here you have Nehru, Nasser, Sukarno, Kwame Nkrumah, and Tito, who founded the non-aligned movement, or what was called NAM, to chalk out a position that was equidistant from the United States and the USSR, to demarcate the third world as an alternative space for self-determination, despite the prevailing exigencies of the Cold War. The novelist, arts editor, and cultural organizer Mulk Raj Anand, who proposed and founded Triennale India, embraced Nehru's internationalist position, which aspired to bypass the cartography of superpower-led geopolitics and remap the world, forging affinities between Asia and Latin America, Asia and Africa, Asia and East Europe. The dream that inspired these initiatives was that of a collegial and equitable multilateralism. It was Nehru who coined the term NAM, non-aligned movement, in 1954 in Colombo, in a speech on the Sino-Indian relationship. The Panchsheel, or the 5 principles he stressed, were mutual respect for each other's territorial integrity and sovereignty, mutual non-aggression, mutual non-interference in domestic affairs, equality and mutual benefit, and peaceful coexistence. The 1955 Bandung Conference, held in Indonesia, was the most important platform for the enunciation of these ideals. It was dedicated to the very optimistic goals of promoting world peace and cooperation, and expressed these through a support for anti-colonial liberation movements across the globe. The non-alignment movement was a utopian project devoted to break the monopoly of the West over the definition and production of internationalism. As against this material and discursive domination of the West, NAM hoped to produce counter-models of political and cultural solidarity. These were to be based on perceived affinities, not on partisan investments on either side of the hegemonic binary of the US or the USSR. In fact, NAM also supported the liberation movements against apartheid in South Africa, also the liberation movement in Zimbabwe. So it was very clearly against any kind of fascism or discrimination. Normally, the genealogy of the term globalism is expressed as a continuous line from internationalism to globalism, from Cold War to post-Cold War politics. With the fall of the Berlin Wall and the economic liberalization of the 1990s, to be taken as the important moments of transformation. What gets missed out here are the points of rupture in this linear narrative. My take on present-day globalism is informed by alternative starting points and anterior histories, such as that of NAM, as well as cultural interventions such as Triennale India, and before that the Sao Paulo Biennale. I read globalism as the deliberate gesture of recovering the human potentialities of the lattices of globalization from the grip of neoliberal policy. To the neoliberal, globalism refers to a nation-state's policy of treating the entire world as if it were a market and source of goods and services. For me, by contrast, the term has a completely different valency. We must not cede the power of words and ideas to the enemy. Globalism, to me, signifies a transcultural, collaborative, multi-participatory mode of performing ideas and conducting projects, with the emphasis on ethical responsiveness and a transformative aesthetics. And I repeat, ethical responsiveness to the global conditions and a transformative aesthetics. Yesterday, I did not really hear the word ethical responsibility or ethical responsiveness. All that was spoken about mostly was, that we have this generic idea of the global world as a market for a homogenization of goods and services. But I think what we forgot to talk about is the agency of the artist and the agency of the artist towards an ethical responsibility. And this is something I'm going to stress through my paper, so that we don't fall into this ridiculous, generic ideas of global art. While neoliberal globalism is an extension of the old imperialist and Cold War geopolitics, my perspective on globalism shifts the locus to the global south and to the act of resistance. Time for a commercial break. Still too fast? Am I still too fast? Okay. Yeah. Okay. So, since 2005, and in fact even a little before that, Ranjit Hoskote, also a cultural theorist, and I have been developing models that deal with the transcultural condition in which we find ourselves today as cultural theorists and cultural practitioners. We have, over the last decade, increasingly found post-colonial theory, and in its classical form, the early Bhabha, Spivak, Said, inadequate to the task of attending to our emerging experiential and epistemological complexity. Classical post-colonial theory was tremendously liberating and even formative, but it is imperative for us to go beyond it now, through the mode of sympathetic critique. One of the first models that Ranjit and I framed was that of critical trans-regionality. Our interest is to remap the domains of global cultural experience by setting aside what seems to us to be exhausted cartographies variously born out of the Cold War, area studies, late colonial demarcations, the war against terror, and supposed clash of civilizations. In the place of these exhausted, even specious cartographies, premised on the paradigm of the West against the rest, we propose a new cartography based on the mapping of the continents of affinities and a search for commonalities based on jointly faced crises and shared predicaments, which produce intriguing entanglements among regional histories staged in Asia, Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe. So the emphasis is on looking for continents of affinities, being complicit in the crises as well as the pleasures and the celebrations of the other. And what is being underlined here is agency, not an inheritance from the past. More recently, in refining this model, we have framed the concept of the nth field. The nth field signifies to us the untagged and the unnumbered zones of cultural and political possibilities that arise from the unpredictable encounters among diverse actors in the transverse spaces which are opened up by migration for dialogue and mutual curiosity. We draw this term from the discipline of computer programming, where the nth field stands for an as yet unspecified but a foreseeable iteration of a loop process. The nth represents the ordinal number, first, second, third, fourth, and infinity. While it seems formally to be a repetition, its actual effects are amplificatory and can be only experienced, so to speak, when you have made the field and arrived in it. We have, of course, adapted this term from computer programming to explain our own cultural political position. The nth field takes us beyond the default binaries of the colonial predicament, whereas Homi K. Bhabha's third space is often conceived in terms of the colonial encounter and its various aftermaths, the contact zone, diaspora, the dissolution of the center-periphery binary, and the circulating mobility between former post-colonial hinterland and former imperial metropole. We have developed the concept of the nth field to mark a transitive engagement among individuals, irrespective of a shared colonial history, which is no longer the only or the most important criteria for an intersection, encounter, or exchange amongst dissimilar subjectivities. Thus, we see the nth field as the site for the staging of a transitivity of horizons, a space where different kinds of cultural imaginations can engage with one another in a dialogue. And where the third space remains associated with the demarcation of difference between self and the other, or even selves and the other, arising from the specific historical crises of the colonial encounter, the nth field is premised on the identification of affinities that form a ground for transcultural mutuality, to be explored through the extension of one's complicity in the crises, but also the pleasure of the other, and through an ethical responsiveness to the predicament of the other. In the nth field, culture is produced through all forms of intersubjective encounters among heterogeneous actors. The crucial factor involved here is the unpredictability of circulation in the epoch of globalization. Today, cultural actors are developing nth fields for themselves, rather than simply finding themselves in contact zones by reason of inheritance or happenstance, or working their way through to a third space against the grain of inherited turbulence. Crucially, therefore, the nth field goes beyond Marie-Louise Pratt's classical conceptualization of the contact zone, which she regards as the site of, and I quote, spatial and temporal consequence of subjects previously separated and whose trajectories now intersect. Instead, the nth field is a site for the active seeking out of engagement, exchange, and intersection through the modes of mutuality, collaboration, and emplacement. I use the word emplacement. It's a word that I have used earlier, and I use it instructively. In terms of the discourse on art in the age of globalization, we normally hear the word displacement. We hear of a nomadic aesthetic which happens through a series of displacements. But I, by contrast, talk about a critical emplacement, by which I mean an experimental poetics of belonging. And this is something which I'll also connect with what Peter Friedel said yesterday, because when people kept trying to put him into a box and saying, so, where do you belong? And he said, I don't belong in any specific space or category or discipline. And I think that that's very important for me, because I would explain that position and find affinities with it and call it a critical emplacement, an experimental poetics of belonging, not one which is marked by certain kinds of inheritances which are always, in a way, demarcated through turbulence or a sense of oppression or a habit of mind. The shift marked here is therefore that from the outcomes of structure to the choices of agency. So it's not about being trapped in that particular structure, whether it's a discipline, a genre, or a practice, but moving towards choice and agency. From a scalar-oriented vision of cultural actors acting out the consequences of the world, historical stagings of travel, colonial expansion, imperial rule, to a vector-oriented account of cultural actors shaping a way in and through a complicated world. In terms of political spatiality too, the nth field redistributes equity through a lattice of newly formulated and negotiated relationships, many of which begin in the awareness that the long existing constraints of asymmetry must be broken. Indeed, such a resistance often overtly inspires and sustains the nth field's relationships of collaboration and synergy. The nth field is based on confident encounter, on the understanding that self and other need not be locked either in communion or in antagonism, hostage to fragmentation or subjugation, but that they can weave together a fabric of what Miwon, my favorite theorist, calls adjacencies and distances. The weave, not the binary. To our generation of cultural producers, location has long ago liberated itself from geography. We map our location on a trans-regional lattice of shifting modes representing intense occasions of collegiality, temporary platforms of convocation, and transcultural collaborations. As we move along the shifting nodes of this lattice, we produce outcomes along what Ranjit Hoskote has called a scale of forms, ranging across informal conversations, formal symposia, self-renewing caucuses, periodic publications, anthologies, traveling exhibitions, film festivals, biennales, residencies, research projects, all the different systems of circulation. This global system of cultural production takes its cue from the laboratory. As in all laboratories, the emphasis is on experiment and its precipitates. However, to the extent that the system is relayed across a structure of global circulations, it also possesses a dimension of theater. A rather large proportion of its activity is in the nature of rehearsal and restaging. We would like to address the dilemmas as well as the potentialities of a mode of cultural production that is based on global circulations but is not merely circulatory. And that is an important distinction to be made. So, and a mode of life that is based on transnational mobility, but is not without anchorage in regional predicaments. That is, again, very important. It's not just about a giddy-headed mobility. Everywhere and increasingly, whether we are teaching at a para-academic platform in Bombay, engaging in curatorial discussions, or conducting research in Berlin, co-curating a biennale in Gwangju, contributing to an international exhibition in Karlsruhe, responding with critical empathy to a triennale in Brisbane, or developing a research project in Utrecht. This is a kind of biography of our lives. We find ourselves working with interlocutors and collaborators in what we think of as nth fields. All nth fields have similar structural, spatial, and temporal characteristics. In structural terms, they are receptive and internally flexible institutions, rhizomatic and self-sustaining associations, or periodic platforms. In spatial terms, they are either programmatically nomadic in the way they manifest themselves or extend themselves through often unpredictable trans-regional initiatives, or are geographically situated in sites to which none or few of their participants are affiliated by citizenship or residence. Temporally, in terms of temporality, the rhythm of these engagements is varied and can integrate multiple timelines for conception and production. These end fields certainly throw into high relief the vexed questions that haunt the global system of cultural production. Who is the audience for contemporary global art? How may we construe a local that hosts or is held hostage by the global? Can we evolve a contemporary discussion that does not merely revisit the exhausted Euro-American debates of the late 20th century by oblique means? Is it possible to translate the intellectual sources of a regional modernity into globally comprehensible terms? What forms of critical engagement should artistic labor improvise as it chooses to become complicit with aspirational and developmentalist capital and its managers across the world? At the same time, these end fields are optimal nodes for the staging of what the art theorist and curator Sarat Maharaj has described as, to quote unquote, entanglements. The braided destinies that knot together selves accustomed to regard one another as binary opposites. Colonizing aggressor, colonized victim, Euro-American citizen, the denizen of the global South, Occidental, Oriental, and so forth. A history delineated under the sign of entanglement lays bare the ideological basis of all these fixed identities, conjoins them in sometimes discomforting but always epiphanic mutualities. When such identities are thus unmasked, denaturalized, and dissolved, we are free to work out new forms of dialogue and interaction across difference, a new and redeeming solidarity. In these complex circumstances, the architecture of belonging can never be static. In our own practice as theorists and curators, we have drafted different versions of it in different places. We have drawn on various models of emotionally and intellectually enriching locality, including the mohalla, which is an Urdu-Hindi word for a web of relationships inscribed within a grid of lanes, streets, and houses, or the kiez, a Germano-Slavic, specifically Berlin word, meaning much the same thing and conferring on the resident the privilege of non-anxious belonging. Or the adda, again a Hindi-Bengali term, meaning a venue for friendly conversations and animated debate. So you have the mohalla, the kiez, the adda, and of course, not to be left out, the symposium, not in the academic format, but in its original sense of a Greek word which signifies the drinking party, that was also a venue for philosophical discussions. These traveling localities are the neighborhoods and convocations where the nth field will be manifested. And what might we discuss at these convocations? The power of infinitives, perhaps to disclose the complicities between an official contemporary and its unacknowledged cousins, to celebrate the carnivalesque, to document the half-forgotten, to allude to elusive historical realities, to annotate our encounters. In the nth field, iterated freshly in every new and provisional neighborhood and convocation, we could generate modes of comprehending, critiquing, and resisting various hazards. The incessancy of theoretical articulation and the riddle-like silence of history. the volatile rhetoric of political elites, and the absolute secrecy of the strategic operations through which they exploit the planet. The vibrancy of the nth field rescues us from being conscripted to the cause of a single past or being mortgaged to a single future. The nth field is a provocation to constantly destabilize and reimagine ourselves beyond our provisional locations, to converse beyond our presuppositions about belonging and alienation, and so to invite ourselves to the feast of hazard. As is obvious from my account of the nth field, the emerging forms of art practice across the globe will be distinguished by a rich particularity, which arises from the specific textures of particular sites, production systems, idioms of dialogue, and strategies of collaboration. As such, this art will have to be gauged ideographically and not in a nomothetic manner. It will have to be gauged instance by instance and not along the rubric of a laid down criteria. So that's very important. Ideographically, not nomothetically. We cannot a priori enumerate its features or themes, except to indicate that certain generic features may be predicated of art that circulates around the global production system of the Biennale circuit or the residency circuit. And those features would be portability, readability, scale, tendency to advise planet-wide concerns, etc. But this enumeration scarcely exhausts the potentiality of forms that emerge in the nth field, forms that may not necessarily be portable or even readily readable, and yet may exert a compelling effect on the viewer. This turns the question, what is global art around on those who ask it? The real answers are who is asking and why. What is the optic through which this question is being phrased? And does it perhaps signal a profound intellectual anxiety in the academy and the museum as against the studio and the Biennale? Perhaps it points to a widening divide between the practitioners of contemporary art and those who wish to bear testimony to it from the older institutions of art history. There can be no longer a universalizing art history in the sense of an epistemological and discursive motor running the Euro-American centers and driving ancillary activity in the various outposts and provinces of the empire. The demand that the artistic imagination situate itself in a universalizing production of meaning marks an unfortunate revision to some notion of a transcendent aesthetic soaring above all the visceral struggles of particularity from which cultural production gathers propulsion. Rather, what we see is the generation of numerous regional histories, each faithful to the textures of its floating point of origin, that are nonetheless woven across each other so that none may be fully understood without reference to the others with which it overlaps. It is understandable that in an age of overproduction, excess, Biennale fever, Biennale syndrome, museum precarity, the traditional institutions are anxious about finding ways of containing the surplus of contemporary art activity. But this form of containment is only a reiteration of what Berger deplored way back in the late 1960s, the tendency to treat art as a property. Those who wish to produce a global art museum or a global art history must attend to the hegemonic tendencies imminent within these projects. Art in the age of globalization eludes neat classifications. It is produced from transversal, crisscrossing relationships and diverse subjectivities. These rich and unpredictable entanglements of practice and approach cannot be reduced to a template of global art. I would now like to show two examples of what we have called critical trans-regionality, the possibility to be complicit in the crisis of the other. Two examples of artworks which are not about cultural tourism or shopping across the world for either any kinds of catastrophes or for goods and services. The first example that I'll be showing is from a camp, which is a platform in Bombay. And it includes people like Ashok Sukumaran, who has an interesting background in new media as well as architecture, and Shaina Anand, who began as a documentary filmmaker, but is very interested in critiquing the very nature of media, whether it is television, documentary, film, or new media art. And the work that I'm showing is called The Neighbor Before the House. And it was made for the Sharjah Biennale. And they decided to actually use this work to map out the landscape of East Jerusalem. And now East Jerusalem is actually a landscape where you see a lot of occupation and the eviction of Palestinian families. So, to counter this, they decided that they would actually use surveillance cameras, which you'll find in malls all over the world and in police stations, etc. Take this everyday surveillance camera with a pan, tilt, zoom mode and place it on the rooftops of these Palestinian families, and then the live feed from what that camera is actually catching. The camera is actually catching, images of houses from where many of these families were evicted, or it's catching the memories of where they used to live. So the live feed of that camera then is connected to the television sets of these families. And over these images, you hear the live commentary of what is it that these residents have lost and what is it that they would like to reimagine. So a surveillance camera, which is a control mechanism of oppression, of censorship, is turned into a participatory mode of reliving memory. Another example is from Minuk Lim. Babel, if you could kindly switch on the Minuk Lim's work. Minuk Lim is a Korean artist living in Seoul, and her work is called The Weight of Hands. Again, there's a with camp, because she also uses surveillance camera, security cameras, and then subverts its original intention. In Korea, in South Korea especially, the artist is bearing testimony to various modes of over-developmentalism, over-construction. Why? Because they want to turn South Korea into a global cultural hub, a Renaissance city, and so forth. Of course, for in a way intensifying cultural tourism. As against this backdrop, the artist figures out a way of resistance. She uses an infrared camera, which is actually meant to detect anything that is illegal, and shoots a group of pilgrims who actually go to these various sites of overconstruction where they're not allowed to go, because of course the government doesn't want people to come and protest against these sites and stop production. So they go in the stealth of night to these places. They are the pilgrims of resistance, and they are shot by an infrared camera, subverting its original function. And she shows them going to all these places stealthily, surreptitiously, and they, in a way, bear witness to these kinds of very destructive developmentalist projects. And the beautiful thing about it is that the infrared, which actually in a way is meant to zero in on anything that is illegal or nefarious or prohibitive, becomes here a way of actually giving energy, and the fire of the infrared camera in a way cleanses this injustice, because what you see here are actually figures made of fire. So, one could symbolically see this as a form of cleansing. And what you see is temperature, energy, and almost a kind of baptism by fire. And you have these people actually going and in a way, going through these various sites. And in the end, it ends with a hand, which in a way invisibly puts itself against the landscape. But it's a hand which is not being biometrically observed by a surveillance system. You could read it as the resisting hand. Please.
세면 저기 멀리 19 손끝 넘어 멀어지는 별 안아도 줄어들지 않고 타오르던 살갗을 더 이상 안아줄 수 없어서 그늘로 돌아서 자장 도닥 흘러 구름이 흩뿌리듯 널 다시는 가두지 않기를 용서의 나를 숨겨 먼 빗방울 안아줄 수 없는 지금을 후회해 올만가는 열 눈시울 마을 열 하나도 하나도 줄지 않고 다시 또 차올라
The need of the hour, then, is not a menu of features of global art, but a greater understanding of the features embedded in the particularities of practice. That is why the nth field, as the model of the future, not only contains the promise of a not yet, but also proposes a model of praxis that is achievable. The nth field is not produced out of institutional or managerial desire, but from the desire of cultural practitioners to map out new continents of affinities. Now to wrap up. In yesterday's discussion, various resolutions to the problem of defining global art were hinted at. For instance, we heard of a possible abnegation of Eurocentric narcissism that has underwritten discursive control over art history and a corresponding receptivity to the perspective of other societies. We heard also of the need to go beyond classical post-Enlightenment aesthetics and to engage with aesthetic philosophies of various societies. Such efforts seem bedeviled by basic problems. They would either lead us to an arid comparativism or reinstate the kind of essentialism that by which Indian art would be judged only by Indian aesthetics or Chinese art only by Chinese aesthetics, which is unproductive since the contemporary art of these societies eludes their classical aesthetics. Meanwhile, would the arts establishment admit the applicability of the aesthetics of the others beyond their designated borders? Or will they continue with the United Nations approach to global art and global aesthetics, where every member has their own locus, but there is no provision for their mingling, dissolution, and the re-emergence under the sign of radical transformation? Art history has committed itself to a self-defeating style of thought, namely teleology. It assumes that processes of art production, circulation, and reception will evolve through alternate phases of confusion and clarity to arrive at a telos, where artistic production and its aesthetic interpretation will then be unified in a state of clarity. But as in Plato's great dialogue, Symposium, production and interpretation are like two halves of the self, always attempting to unite, but failing because one half eternally flees the other. That is the fate to which art history must reconcile itself. Production will always elude, defy, mock, and oftentimes remain in advance of interpretation. It is not containable in categories, and all our concepts and narratives are approximations, wagers, shifting pictures. The nth field, on the other hand, marks a break with teleological thinking. It does not conscript artistic practice into a priori academic thinking, ignoring the complexities of the present. The nth field demands attentiveness to the present of practice. It does not see artists as bearers of pre-existing cultures, but as agents of volition. The nth field demands that the discipline of art history be broken, remade, and reimagined to address the reality of changing art practice, and not the other way round. Thank you.